Hi, my name is Sandoval-Hernández, and today I'm going to talk to you about international large-scale assessments in education. So let's start. For this lecture, the purpose is to discuss the impact that international large-scale assessments have had on policy, research, and practice. I also would like to describe the scope, objectives, methods, and information produced through these assessments, discuss the main challenges and criticisms posed by different actors against the same assessments, and discuss how these tensions can be solved. These are like the best known studies, as I was saying, but we also have regional studies, and this is because, as you will see, as we will discuss a bit later, because of some of the criticisms to these studies about the comparability across countries with very different education system, very different culture. Some other organizations came up with the idea of having regional studies. So, for example, UNESCO is one who has been an organization that has been supporting assessments in education, international assessment in education, and probably the one of the most famous is the TERCE, called as TERCE, and this is the third regional comparative and explanatory study. TERCE is the acronym by the because the original name is in Spanish, so it doesn't match completely. But anyway, this is also an assessment based on grades. This is applied on 3rd grade and 6th grade, and the last time 15 countries in Latin America participated. So this is a regional study for Latin America. We also have SACMEC, which is the Southern and Eastern Africa Consortium for Monitoring Education Quality. This is a study that is normally applied on 6th grade, but it has been applied on different grades in different countries. And the last time, 14 countries participated. And this study is in the Anglophone East Africa. This is the region that they target. We also have the World Bank. They sponsored or they support PASEC, which is the analysis program of the Confinement education systems, and this is applied normally in 2nd and 5th grades, and the last time again 13 countries in Francophone West Africa participated. So as you can see, in the case of SACMEC and PASEC, they both are in Africa, but they are focused on the region, geographical region, but also on the language. So in the case of SACMEC is Anglophone, in the case of PASEC, this is Francophone West Africa. The World Bank is also supporting PRIDI, which is the regional project on child development indicators, and this is a study that takes place or targets pre-primary students, so before they go to primary education. And in the first round, it was a kind of a pilot. There were only 4 countries participating in Central America. So as you can see, apart from the big or more famous, most popular international large-scale assessment, regional studies are focusing on the needs, on the different needs that they have according to the region, according to the culture, according to the language. So as you can see, teams and pearls are very similar in the sense that they are testing 8th graders or 15 years old who are more or less in most countries in 8th grade, and they do more or less the same. But in some countries they thought that it made more sense to test 3rd graders or 2nd graders, 5th graders, or even pre-primary studies. So they change, they adapt according to the different needs in the region. We also have some studies that have been, and those are probably more recent. They have been designed especially for low or middle income countries, and some examples are the one that is supported by the USAID, the United States Agency for International Development, and this is called EGRA or ECMA, which is the early grade reading for EGRA, or early grade mathematics assessment for ECMA, and this is applied in early grades. And so far, more than 40 developing countries have used the frameworks, the methodology of EGRA and ECMA. And in this case, again, we can see that there is an adaptation for the specific needs of these low and middle income developing countries. So in this case, this test is much more simple than the other ones. As you will see, we will be talking about the technical characteristics of the studies, but in this one, this is only about recognizing, for example, for EGRA, it's about recognizing letters. So it's not a reading test, but it's just to what extent students recognize letters, to what extent they can read words, and to what extent they can read sentences or paragraphs. But it's what I want to say is that it's a much more simplified version of these literacy assessments. I will tell you a bit more about the other ones a bit later, so you can understand better the difference. We also have, in more recently, we have that the main organizations running these studies, they have also finally realized, or finally get to know or get to accept that these international assessments have to be adapted, because the countries that are participating in them are very diverse and they have very different characteristics. So for example, because of that, the IEA, which is one of the pioneer organization in these kind of assessments, they are just releasing, they are just planning, they are just recruiting countries for running LANA, which is the literacy and numeracy assessment. And this is going to be applied at the end of primary schools. This hasn't even started, but they are planning it, they are announcing it right now. And again, this is going to be an easier version, a simplified version of Teams and Pearls. Is in this case, because they have realized with experience, for example, that some countries that have participated in Teams and Pearls, their achievement level of the students of those countries is so low that they are below the scale, so they cannot even compare to the other countries. So they are releasing this study, which is going to be a simplified version in technical terms, but also an easier version for students, with the advantage or with the attractive that the scale of this test is going to be linked, or it's going to be possible to link it to the scores in Teams and Pearls. So comparisons could be made at some point. And we also have PISA, which is the other very strong, very famous study that they are also planning right now. They are running a pilot for running PISA-D, which is PISA for Development. Again, this is going to be for 15 years old. This is forthcoming. This is not happened yet, but again, this is an adaptation of the main PISA study to countries, to developing countries. So there's going to be an easier version, and they're going to collect information that is more relevant for the context of developing countries. Why international studies? Why do we want to have international studies? And they have two main reasons, which is they have a benchmarking function. So they provide comparable indicators on student performance and schooling practices across countries. And you can see a jump bar there, because as it can happen, it just give them a reference to evaluate the performance of the students in different countries. And I give you an example. For example, in PISA, the first time that PISA was run was in 2000, and this is the first time that Germany participated in one of those international comparative studies. And they had the idea, the German society, the German government, that German students were very strong, but it happened that when they participated in this study for the first time, they ranked in the middle. So they realized that their students were not performing as well as they were expecting, and they called that the PISA shock. And what happened is that, well, how high can you jump? It depends. And for example, you can apply national tests, but then you don't know if the test is, and you can say that the students in this country are doing very well, but probably it's just because the test is very easy, so they're going to be doing well all the time. But when you apply the same test to different to comparable students in different countries, then you can compare how well you're doing in relation to this international test. So this is just one of the things that they can use. for this kind of studies. And also it's very often interesting to compare, for example, with the top performer countries, but also with your neighbors of the countries that have similar education systems, countries that have similar history and cultural contexts. So it's interesting to compare, because if one of those countries is doing better than the other, they can always learn from each other and see what exactly they are doing for them to probably implement or get some ideas on what kind of policies they can implement in different countries in order to improve or strengthen the education system. This has been criticized, of course, but we will talk about that in a minute. Then we have the analytic function, which is they can also be used to suggest hypotheses about the relationship between student performance and factors that may influence the performance. And this is you have on the one hand, you have the student performance, how well they do in the test. On the other hand, these studies, as we will discuss, they also collect information about the context. So you may, when you see that one country do better than other, you may wonder why is this country doing better, and then the answer might be at the level of the students, characteristics of the students, how much they study, how much homework they do, etc., etc. But it could also be characteristics of the school, what kind of teachers they have, what kind of infrastructure the schools have, what kind of teaching practices are implemented in the classroom, what kind of accountability schools have, what kind of supervision schools are, how are schools supervised, etc., etc. It could be at the national level. No? It would be at what age students are starting to go to school, or it could be how much, what proportion of the how much money is the government investing in education per pupil, for example, and so on and so forth. So the reasons why one country performs worse or better might be related with a series of factors. So these studies can also be used to suggest hypotheses or to test hypotheses about the relationship between different factors at the student, school, system level and the educational achievement of the students, but also to suggest hypotheses about areas in which students have particular strengths or weaknesses, because you can have mathematics, but this studies also test studying in subscales, which is, for example, geometry or probability. So you can see in your country or in different countries in what areas students are doing better. It could be mathematics, or it could be reading, could be civic education. So you can see in what parts of the education system can be strengthened, or what parts are weak. And I have the picture of a map there because it's just like a way of having a big map and having have you seen these maps with red lights? They mark where you may have problems. So it's something similar. You can have a map of your education system and have red lights blinking in the areas in which you need to strengthen the education system. So they use these studies for this benchmarking function and for this analytic function. But what do they do with this information that they collect and they analyze? And well, here in this slide you can see a sample. This is the studies that were published only with teams and peers, so only with 2 of those studies in 6 months, in a period of 6 months. So as you can see, there are a lot of studies published. So they are published in peer-reviewed journals, they are published in academic journals, they are published in newspapers, they are published in reports, in policy briefs. They are analyzing this information, they are producing it, and people is reading it, and people is taking ideas from there in order to improve their education system. So as you can see, the list goes on and on and on and on, and this is only 6 months. So you can imagine, since this studies started, how many publications we have had from them. So, but what questions are these publications? What questions are in general are these studies answering? And the kind of questions that you can answer is, what should students learn? This is the first questions that you might have. What should they learn when they are fourth grade? What should they learn when they are at eighth grade, when they are 15 years old, when they are in pre-primary education? When you are an adult and are already working, what should you learn? And then the second question, another question could be, who provides the instruction? So who are the teachers? How old are they? How much experience they have? How much professional development they have? How well they are paid, etc., etc. How is this instruction organized? How many hours of education, of schooling they have per week, per year? What kind of things are they being taught, with what methods, etc., etc. And also, where does instruction take place? How are the schools in different countries? You go to school in different countries, how different they are, what kind of equipment they have, how many students are in average per classroom, what is the student-teacher ratio, what is the ratio of administrative staffs in schools, etc., etc. Then what is taught? So one thing is what the students should learn. This is the curriculum that is in the books or in the papers that lists all the topics that students should learn when they are in fourth grade, in eighth grade, when they are 15 years old. And a different thing is what they are taught, what they are actually being taught by teachers. And then we have some other questions like, are the students well prepared to meet the challenges of the future? Whatever that means. Are the students, I mean, of course, you can define what that means if you want to answer formally to this question. And are they able to analyze, reason, and communicate their ideas effectively? What are the factors associated with educational achievement, as we were discussing before, or on what students have learned? So this is the interesting thing. One thing is what the students should learn, which is the curriculum, what is in the list of topics that they have to learn. Another thing is what they are taught. I mean, what are teachers teaching all the curriculum, all the topics in the curriculum, or only some of them? Why? I mean, this could be for many different reasons, but it's certainly important to know what are teachers actually teaching. And the third thing, which is important, is what did the students learn? One thing is what they should learn, another thing is what they are taught, and a third thing is what they have learned. So you can test these three different things and then have comparisons and analysis with the answers that you get to these questions. So, but what is common across all these studies? Something that is common is that their interest, of their objective, is to report on group level characteristics rather than individual results. So these are not tests. These that we were talking about, those are international comparative studies. They are not interested, or their objective is not to report on individual results, but rather on group level characteristics. The average achievement of a country, the average achievement of girls in a country, the average achievement of low socioeconomic status students in a country, the average achievement of public schools in a country, etc., etc. The results of these studies are valid for the whole education system. This is also important. Of course, not all students in fourth grade or all 15 years old students in a country are tested. However, they are made in a way that the average results are valid for the whole education system. So if we say just to say something, the average score of girls in Slovenia is 500 points. This applies to the whole country, even though the test probably was taken only for, I don't know, 200-300 girls. Anyway, the result is made in a way, the sample is taken in a way that this result is going to be valid for the whole education system. Another thing in common is that they study domains that are very broad. I mean, when we say mathematics are fourth grade, just the list of topics that students have to to master when they finish 4th grade is really long. I mean, there's lots of information that they have to test. They also have in common that they have limited testing time and budget. So they cannot, it has been calculated that if you want to test a student in 4th or 8th grade on all what they should know by then, the test would take like 10 hours. So you would need to have the student sitting on a table answering a test for 10 hours in a row, which is just not possible. I mean, you cannot do that. After 2 hours maximum, probably less, the student is not going to be able to keep on answering questions. And also is the time that you're going to take from schooling, the schooling time that you're going to take for them to do this test. And remember, I just mentioned some of the most common studies, some of the most popular, but some countries take them all. So if you discount all the time that they're going to take in taking tests, plus the national test, plus the regional tests in the, I mean, for the state in which the school is, for example, then it is crazy. I mean, it is just too much time. So the time that that can be allocated to these international assessments is limited, and also the budget. I mean, you cannot test all the students in a country because that would be very expensive also, no? So they have challenges. They need to administer to a representative sample, so they cannot administer the test to all the students in the country, but a sample. But this sample has to be representative. So the sample of students that you choose have to represent well the whole population, all the students in the education system. They need to be administered in a sensible design. So as I said, you cannot ask a child to sit for 10 hours in a row to answer a test. So you have to do it in a sensible way. So how are you going to do it? And then they need to summarize and compare performance on the items. So how do they face these challenges? How do these studies face these challenges? And they have a complex sample design and they have a complex assessment design. When I say they have a complex sample design, I mean the sample is probabilistic, stratified, multi-stage, and clustered. And well, we're not going to go into detail with that, but just let me tell you that sample is something that is very common in our day-to-day life. So for example, here we have a picture and we have a sample of pixels. We have a sample of 5,000 pixels. So you cannot see much with this sample, right? So you cannot see what is in the picture. You see some pixels there and that's it. If we increase the sample to this 500 pixels, if we increase it to 5,000 pixels, this is what we have. And we can start to see what is in the picture with a bigger sample. This is a random sample, no? So pixels taken at random and anywhere. If we increase the sample once more to 50,000 pixels, we can see what's in the picture, right? So, however, this is a random sample, so we can say that each pixel is one student, and the picture is the education system. So if you take only 500 students, and this is just to say a number, of course the numbers in reality are different. You take only 500 students, you cannot see much, you cannot tell much about how is the education system, but you increase the sample and then you can start knowing what's in the picture. So the bottom line message is that you don't have to take all the pixels to see what is in the picture or how the picture looks like. It's the same thing in the education system. You don't have to take all the students to know how this education system is performing. Another example would be a blood sample. You go to the doctor because you're feeling bad or you have to take some analysis, and they're going to take a sample of your blood. You're not going to ask the doctor, you know what, doctor, so to be sure, why don't you take all my blood to test it, and then just so we are sure what is going on. So you don't do that. So you take a sample and then you trust the results of on your blood test based on very small amount of blood. And it's the same when you cook a soup. You are cooking a soup, you put some salt, and you don't have to drink the whole soup to know if the soup is salty or not. Just take a spoon, mix it well, try it, and then based on that you can judge whether you have to add more salt or less salt. So it's the same here. Now, we say that it is a complex sample because we have a cluster sample. So this is the same 50,000 pixels, but they are clustered. They are clustered because they are together, and they are together because they are schools. So every square here is a school. So when you have something like that, you cannot see very well what's going on in the education system. So you have to apply specific special statistic techniques in order to make to know with this cluster sample design what's going on in your study. And the same thing is for the complex assessment design. This is a multiple matrix assessment design where nobody takes all items and no items are given to all. No items are given to all because to begin with you are not testing all the students, and the items are the questions in the test. So as I said, the test of mathematics is too long. We said that if one single student answers the whole test, it would take him 10 hours. So you cannot do that. So what you do instead is take the whole exam, the whole test, and divide it. So each student answers one part of the test. Right? So this is an interesting idea, and it's an easy way to do it. So we answer the test in teams, right? So everyone takes one part of the test. The problem comes because, as I mentioned before, you have to have a comparable score for all students. So how are you gonna compare the students if they took different exams? So what you do is to have this multiple matrix design, and what you're gonna do is just give one part of the test to each student, and then you are gonna you're going to and then you're going to give it to the students, and then you have to compute a score. But you cannot compute a normal score. You cannot compute a normal score because everyone took a different test. So a normal score would be, for example, percentage correct. So what is the percentage of correct answers? And then you could compare the students, but you cannot do that because everybody took a different test, or many children took a different test. So you can say student A had 80% correct, student B had 90% correct. So you cannot say that the student that got 90% correct knows more or has a higher achievement than the other student, because it might be that the student that had 90% of the items correct had an easier exam. So what you do is gonna compute a score that is gonna take into account the difficulty of the items. So the items that are more difficult count more or weight more, and in that way you can solve this issue. You can face that challenge. So when you do that, then you can compute a score that is comparable, but still you have a score that represents only one part of the test, and you have to have a score that represents the whole domain, the whole mathematics, the whole reading, the whole science. So how do you do that? So what you're gonna do is to impute the score for the part of the test, for the other part of the test that the student didn't take. So basically what you want to know is what would the student have had in the test, what mark he would or she would have had in the test if he or she had taken the whole test, all the items. As we discussed before, this is not possible to do, but you have to have a guess. And what you're gonna do is to have an informed guess, scientifically informed guess. And then how you're gonna do it? Because you know the items that the student got correct, and you know the difficulty of all the items, you can infer or you can predict whether these particular students would have had a correct would have answered correct the items that he or she didn't take. But because you are guessing, what you are going to have is a set of 5 plausible values. So if you are guessing, the ability distribution is a distribution. So if you guess only once, let's say the plausible value 1, if you guess only once, it could be that you guess and the student get this point, this score, let's say 500 points. But it could be that your guess is here and you are overestimating what he could have get, or it could be that it's here. So to avoid that, what you're going to do is to guess 5 times, and you're going to have 5 plausible values, or you're going to have 5 possible values that the student. If we summarize that, we have a complex sample design, we have a complex assessment design, and the consequences for the analysis is that for the complex sample design, that you have to have sampling weights and replicate weights. And this is to account for the cluster sample, for the fact that you have a sample and for the fact that it is clustered. And for the complex assessment design, you have to have these plausible values, which is these 5 scientifically informed guesses of what the student would have had if he had taken the whole test, because he or she didn't. And that means that you have to, that is going to complicate the computation of the standard errors, basically. So, and in order to take into account the sampling error, basically, and of course I don't want to bore you with the technicalities in this formula, but basically means that you have to compute for the sampling error, for the complex sample design, you have to compute whatever you are computing. Let's say the average achievement, you have to compute it 80 times. 80 times, so you can account for this cluster sample design. And then for the assessment error, you have to compute it 5 times, which is once for each plausible value. And then you have to do it 80 times with each of the 5 plausible values. So you have to do it many times. So basically that complicates the things. Then you add up these 2 errors, and then you take the square root, and then you have the standard error that you need to report in every statistic that you compute. So as you can see, this is complicated, but fortunately there are software that can do these things automatically, so you don't have to do it by hand. But anyway, it's just to give you a sense of how the technical complications of these studies. And then what are some of the criticisms of these studies? And for example, and I have a list of some of them, some of the most popular or most important here, but they are not, of course, they are not comprehensive. One first criticism would be related to the analysis that we were discussing, and actually I don't have a bullet point for it, is the complexity of these studies. It's very complicated to do any kind of analysis, and therefore not many people, or many people cannot do it or cannot do it correctly. So this would be one of the main criticisms. The answer to that would be that this is the only way in which, or the most efficient way in which the challenges that we were talking about can be faced. But well, this is just one of the criticisms, or one of the things that make it difficult for people to use these studies. And another one could be that some scholars, some academics, some people, they simply oppose to large-scale international assessments of any kind. What they say is that the model that these studies use assumes that there are homogeneous populations of students. For example, in other words, that students in Peru are equals to students in Italy, to students in Singapore, and to students in USA. And not only the students, but also the schools and the education systems, etc., etc., etc. So they are comparing the students as if they were the same. So this would be the main criticism. Of course, there are some ways in which, by using statistical techniques, you can correct for the differences, but still, this is one of the criticisms that you have. So many other people have objected to the league table ranking because this promotes a culture of shame and blame, and it also, this is the only thing that you get in the news when these studies are released, the league table, the horse racing, who did better, and how many points, and who is in the top, who are the top 5, who are the top in the bottom of the table, etc., etc. So many people think that this is not making any good to any education system in general. Other people criticize PISA in particular, and PISA because of the organization that sponsors it, the OECD, because this is an economic organization with a very clear political agenda. So they say that the PISA results and the PISA reports and the PISA publications promote a free market agenda in education, which many people said is not the right way to go. So and they criticize that they promote openly this kind of agenda. They also say that these PISA studies like PISA and others have a narrow, limited view of an education system, which is simplifying the whole education system to mathematics, science, and reading. Others say that about PISA again, that they have a heavy bias towards the OECD countries, but still recruit many partner participants. So they say that this study is relevant. This study is well designed for OECD countries, which are developed countries, but still they recruit developing countries to participate in the study. And a little bit the response to this criticism, to the OECD and others, is the new studies that they are developing. The PISA for development, in the case of the OECD, LANA, the literacy and mathematics study by the IEA, and also the regional studies as we were talking about before. So we have these studies sponsored by the UNESCO, by the World Bank, by the USAID, which, by the way, this EGRA, as I was saying before, this is a much more simple study, so they don't have all these issues with the complex sample and complex assessment design. They have a much more straightforward design, and well, they would have only, for example, sampling weights, and that's it. So those are some of the responses, some of the criticisms, and some of the responses that organizations and countries and people supporting these studies are giving. But we have some other criticisms more related to technical issues. For example, the sampling. In the last round of PISA, for example, Shanghai was the country, or in this case the education system, that performed at the top of the table. So they were the best performing education system in the whole table. However, it was criticized that the sampling framework, that is, the students that are represented in this sample, are only 79% of the students who are actually in the education system. So many of those students that are actually living in Shanghai, they are not in the study. They were not sampled. So, and those studies are the weaker students. So many people was criticizing that, because they say, well, then you are telling me that Shanghai is a very strong education system, but actually they took only their best students to participate in the study. And well, this biased all the results, and is not very informative in many senses, no? So we have also some issues that are related with the interpretation of the analysis of these studies. And basically the criticism here is that the data is being pushed to and beyond reasonable boundaries. So we have, for example, this guy, the director of PISA in the OECD. He's got a blog and he's got a Twitter account, and he's very often saying things like, PISA shows what is possible in education, and it takes away excuses from those who are complacent. Success will go to those individuals, institutions, and countries which are swift to adapt, slow to complain, and open to change. So again, what he's assuming here is that all education systems, all students just have to work hard, and they will be good, and they will do good in education, without taking into account that in many cases there are other barriers, other difficulties that students have to go through in order to learn, in order to do good in education. It's not the same to be a student in Nigeria, to live in Nigeria and go to school, than to live in Sweden and go to school. I mean, the education system is different, the culture is different, the equipment of schools is different. There are many things that can be different. Some students have to walk for 3 or 4 hours to get to school every morning, and some students are picked up by the school bus. Some schools in countries like in Latin America, Mexico, and Guatemala, they don't even have a toilet in the school. They don't even have a roof in the school. And some other schools are concerned because the heating is not working well. So you have all these kind of issues. You have all these kind of differences that have to be taken into account in order to make comparisons. And statements like the ones of this guy, Andreas Schleicher is his name, they are not taking into account these things. No? Let me give you some examples. But before, let me give you a word of caution. Some other things that are that have to be taken into account when using this data, these studies, this information, is that they are surveys. They are more like surveys and not that much as tests. That so you have to take information from they do take information not only from the test of the achievement in mathematics or reading on science. They also are surveys, so they take information from students. They ask them how much they study, how much time they spend in doing homework, if their parents are helping them with the school or not, if they have extra school activities or not, etc., etc. They collect information from the teachers. They ask them who they are, how old they are, how much experience they have, what kind of training and work training they have, how they get along with the other teachers, with the head teacher, etc., etc. How happy they are in their work, etc., etc. They take information from the school principal and about the school, no? What kind of infrastructure they have, how they manage their budget, how is accountability in the school, how is the supervision, etc., etc. Also, it's important to say that with these studies we know what students know and can do now, or can do at the moment of the test, and the context in which this occurs in the moment of the test. And this is changing all the time, no? What the students know now is not what they will know tomorrow, or what they will know in 1 year or 1 month after or before. So this is changing all the time. The context is changing all the time. The infrastructure, the equipment that a school has one day would be different if you measure that on a different day, and so on and so forth. So this is more like a picture, and we have to be conscious. We have to know that the realities in real life, schools are changing all the time. From 1 year to the other, one school can be doing very good, and next year they are not doing good at all because the head teacher changed, because of many different reasons. So schools have complex realities, and this has to be taken into account. Also, we have the information on the background information about the students, their parents, their schools, their teachers, in the moment when the test is taken. But the learning, the effect might have occurred while back ago. So, for example, let's say let me give you an example. We have one of the most important predictors of achievement is how many books students have at home. So in general, across the world and across countries and grades and everything, the more the books the student has at home, the better they do at school. In general, this is like a very clear pattern. However, we can know how many books the student, the question is how many books do you have at home? So the student may answer, I have 100 books, but not for having 100 books he's going to do better. The important thing is that the effect of having the books on his or her achievement occurred a while ago. So this is because his or her parents were reading him or her bedtime stories, for example. And this is, the student might be in 8th grade now, maybe around 15 years old, but that the parents were reading stories to him 10 years ago. So we have to be conscious about all these things. We have, in other words, we have cross-sectional information with repeated independent measures over the time. So we have a picture, we don't have a movie, we don't have something that is changing, we just have the information in one point in time. So we cannot make statements about causation, we can only say correlations. In other words, we cannot say that we can say things like students who do better in mathematics tend to have teachers who take professional development courses in mathematics. We cannot say things like higher professional development, higher frequency in professional development causes or equals higher student achievement in mathematics. We know that they are associated, but we don't know that one thing is causing the other. Or another example could be students who are more motivated do better. So you can say there is an association between motivation and educational achievement. But you cannot say that motivation causes better educational achievement. It's probably the other way around. It could be that higher achievement causes higher motivation. So you don't know, and you don't know because these studies are cross-section. So this is just one point in time. However, as we said before, these surveys, these studies have an invaluable, a very high descriptive power. So they can be used to describe what is the state of the education systems, where are the strengths, the weaknesses, etc. An example of benchmarking function. This is the Center for International Education Benchmarking in the US, and they, for example, they have a web page. You can just follow the links here or Google this page and Google this heading, and you will get to this web page. And this is interesting because they take the top performing countries and they make qualitative case studies of them. So, for example, let's say Hong Kong. Hong Kong is driven by a diverse population with ever-changing needs, and they have refocused its education system to mesh with its international economic goals. And then you have a link there that says explore the policies that push them to the top. So this is one of the top performing countries, but they also have a specific characteristic, that is that they have a very diverse population. This population has been changing, it's changing all the time, and that causes that they have different needs. Their needs are changing. So how are they adapting to these changes in order to keep the students at the top? You have the case of Japan, for example. Japan is one of the countries that tend to perform well in these studies, but it was also a country where the students work harder than almost anywhere else, and they learn more. But there were lots of concern in Japan because students were a lot under pressure, and they were always pressured by the how hard they had to work to perform well at school. So discover how, this is the link, Japan has relieved students' pressure without decreasing student performance. So how they are doing that, and those kind of things are interesting for the other countries that may be in similar situations. This issue with the pressure on students to do well in school is very evident in Japan, but it's not the only countries. In many Asian countries, this is the case. So these countries in Asia, for example, might be interested in knowing how Japan is doing to decrease the pressure on students. There are many other countries now with all the immigrants and the refugees in different countries in Europe, for example. It could be interesting how Hong Kong has been adapting to the changes in population, to a diverse population, because from there other countries can learn to adapt their education systems to the needs, to the changing needs of a diverse population, and so on and so forth. Another thing that can be done is this analytic function, which is to study the effect of some variables on achievement. So we have here teams period, so the achievement in reading, science, mathematics. So you can, with the statistical models, you can control for resources for learning at home and early reading and math skills. Resources for learning at home is whether the students have a computer, whether they have internet, whether they have a desk to do their homework, for example. And early reading and math skills is what they already knew when they come to school, when they came to school for the first time, what they learned in pre-primary school, for example. So with mathematical statistical models, you can keep these variables constant, which means if all the students had the same resources for learning, and if all of them had the same skills, reading and math skills, when they came to school, and then you have the analysis variables. If these were constant, if they were the same for all students, how much security and order atmosphere affects achievement, or how much support for academic success in the school affects achievement, how much the infrastructure in the school affects achievement, how much the training of teachers affects achievement, and so on and so forth. So we can explore the relationship between some specific variables that we have reasons to believe are going to be important, while controlling for other variables, while keeping constant some other characteristics. So you can you can test this kind of hypothesis. I mean, like training of the teachers. You may have the hypothesis that the more the training, or the better the training, the better the achievement of the students. So you can test for that while controlling for some other things to see whether this is the So some examples of the impact of these international large-scale assessments in policy, as a little bit as I was saying before. So things that have changed in countries. So for example, in Iceland and in Japan, they increased the teaching hours for mathematics and science instruction at the elementary level. So for example, Iceland and Japan, and this is the thing, they could only know that they were teaching less hours of mathematics and science when they compared to other countries. So two things happened. First, they realized that they were not doing as good as they were thinking in comparison to other countries. And second, they realized that they were teaching less hours of mathematics and science to their students. So they changed that. That was a change in policy. They increased the number of hours, and they improved their achievement years later. No? In Singapore, for example, they did targeted secondary analysis of this kind of data, and their results led to the development of teaching resources to enhance cognitive and metacognitive skills. So, and this is the other thing that I was saying. You can test mathematics, science, reading, but you can also test the subdimensions of that. So Singapore is one of the top performing countries as well, but they realized at the same time that the cognitive and metacognitive skills, they were not as good as they were thinking, or as good as the other areas. So those were the parts, the areas that they needed to strengthen. So they did it. In Australia, for example, the analysis of these kind of studies revealed a significant gender and socioeconomic gap. So they realized that in mathematics, boys were doing much better than girls, and reading, girls were doing much better than boys. And they also realized that there was a huge gap in achievement between the students with high socioeconomic status and low socioeconomic status. So they wanted to improve this kind of inequalities, so they implemented compensatory programs to address these gaps, to address these issues. In Kenya, for example, they had Kenya is one of those, as many low, medium income countries in the recent decades, and some countries in this more recently, they have been expanding the education system. That is, it was not the case that not all children were going to primary school, so they had a limited coverage that was not 100%. So at some point they pushed it to have all the children in school, to have all the children attending primary school or lower secondary school. But they had the concern that by doing that, I mean, the population who was not in school, who was not in the education system, was of course the more marginalized population, the most socioeconomically disadvantaged population. So when you bring all this population to the education system, is normally, or what you would expect is that you're going to have problems to keep the quality of the education, because it's you have to create schools, you have to have new teachers. The students with low socioeconomic status tend to perform lower than the more advantaged peers, etc. So they use these kind of studies to monitor the impact of the free universal primary education on quality. So just to keep the levels of quality to the same standard, and to see where they have to strengthen the schools, the teachers, the policies, in order to do it. And well, this is the case in Kenya, but not only in Kenya. In several countries in Latin America, for example, was the same case. Another example is the case of Slovenia, where suddenly countries came up with the idea of having a study on civic education study, and Kenya and Slovenia, they didn't have a curriculum on civic and citizenship education, so they took the template, let's put it like that, of their curriculum in civic and citizenship education from this study, from the example of the other countries, for the curriculum of other countries that participated in this study. So those are examples of how these studies have impact the policy, the educational policy in general. And well, thank you very much. That's it for this presentation. Please do not hesitate to contact me in case you have any questions. I would be more than happy to talk to you about it. Thank you, and see you next time.